Family mode.
Hi there and welcome. This is Derek Feldman with Achieve. I hope you're doing well today on this Wednesday. And we're glad that you're with us for the next 45 minutes to the hour to talk about development directors and whether or not we should hire one. This is about several years ago, we developed a white paper around this concept. And every year as we start to pull out some ideas for some of the sessions together, this by far continues to be one of our most popular only because a lot of you might be struggling with deciding whether or not you need to actually hire a development director. So we're glad that we'll be expanding upon this concept and what we have found. And of course, as we end here, you can have this presentation. You can even, I'll give you the report and white paper that we produced several years ago on the piece too to share with your board if you would like that too as well. As I mentioned, we'll be together for roughly about an hour, 45 minutes of content, about 15 minutes worth of questions. So feel free to put those into the go-to webinar panel, and we'll make sure and get to those later. And of course, any of you needing any sort of credentialing, CFREs and others, will provide that for you too as well. Just respond to the email too. So as I mentioned, this has been an ongoing discussion and probably one that I feel has been a discussion for a lot of small groups who are really challenged with whether we pull the trigger or not of hiring our first development director. And we have a series of questions and things that we typically go through. But as I continue to look at the landscape of nonprofits, as they're sort of on this growth potential, a lot of organizations are challenged with, can we really afford it? Is this something, and what's the real ROI that we should expect going forward? And I think it comes down to several discussions as we look as a group together. And that first one is that we actually have both short-term needs and long-term outlook on our fundraising together. What that means is that most of us come to this decision of needing a development director because of something that just happened, or is that we anticipate a lot of activity going to occur over the course of the next 6 months, or that we have a short-term need that we need to try and raise money for. And because of that, our immediate sort of knee-jerk reaction is, let's hire a development director, they'll raise their money, they'll raise their salary, things will all be grand, and we'll go from there and we'll start to beef up the staff and so on. Unfortunately, that type of positioning really doesn't help an organization. And as we have sort of fielded in some question and answer with some speaking engagements that I've done and others, is that it always comes back to that those that make a short-term decision to hire a development director, they tend to let them go in about a year or so after they are not getting what they need out of the relationship and or the fundraiser is frustrated too on their end. We also see this balance with sort of this long-term outlook where an organization believes that long-term they need this to be successful. Now, granted, it would be great if you had a full-time fundraiser all of the time devoted to resource development for your organization. However, what you have to really balance is whether or not the long-term outlook will help you support that person long-term, just as if you would even have a programmatic person. You know, I always compare it to that we probably have a lead program person. And just like we need to set them up for success, we need to set a fundraiser up for success. And therefore, you know, do we have the long-term outlook to say we're going to provide the resources and the budgeting in order to enable that development director to be successful? We also see this struggle between both paid and volunteer staff in sort of taking it from, I need to raise money and I'm paid to do that versus we're going to use volunteers to fill certain roles. Every organization that has started out has really started in this mode of creating a core volunteer base of people. I mean, some of the earliest organizations got volunteers together who are passionate about a cause and went out, raised resources, and created a mission for an organization that they care deeply about. And then over time, as they sophisticated, both in operations and then in their programs, they started to add staff within the fundraising department too as well. And as we look at that paid volunteer staff role, is that at some point there was a decision for most organizations to say that no longer are we going to use skilled volunteers to perform certain duties, but rather we're going to pay people to perform those duties who might have either more skills or we can at least allocate their time accordingly. Now, the challenge is that we're always in this delicate and sometimes awkward balance between paid and volunteer. And it happens more on the fundraising side than it really happens on the programmatic or organizational side. And I'll say probably the biggest piece that you'll see this sort of struggle between is whether or not board members really raise money. I mean, all of us want our volunteer board members to go out there and raise money. Unfortunately, when they don't do that job that hopefully we've told them about in advance, the paid staff will start to pick it up. And in certain instances, we see the paid staff start to pick up a lot more of those, and to a certain extent will really let the board kind of go. Both in our frustrations and the fact that the job just isn't getting done, and so the staff will need to come along and, as a friend of mine always says, is to become the lint trap to catch whatever's not done and just to perform that work. Now, we unfortunately are setting it up for a very big challenge going forward in that as we start to use volunteers and we start to coordinate more paid staff into jobs that volunteers would do in the past, is that we have this awkward challenge of saying we'll handle it going forward. In reality, we have a lot of expectations of them going forward, and we never really communicate them. So this awkward balance will always exist, whether or not you have 20 fundraisers and you have the biggest fundraising department, and whether or not you can try and activate your volunteer core, your board members, your closest constituents and donors to go out there and actually raise money. And I'd say the third thing is sort of the wants and resources balance that we have to do as organizations. And in that instance, it's, we really want to be in a big organization. We really want so many people to know about us, love us, give us money all of the time. And it is our belief that we don't have the resources to make that happen. Now, I'll say that today, it's probably, we live in an environment today where you can actually launch opportunities with minimal resources. If you haven't read a book, I'd highly recommend, called The Lean Startup. The book is more about the startup entrepreneurial spirit, but what's exciting about that book is that he always talks about what he calls a minimal viable product, is that it's no longer necessary to create, in the marketing and the business world, to create a product that's complete from end to end. So that would be is that if we had a new product out there, let's just say a cereal, that we'd create everything that would be completely done and put it to market, rather than just sending out elements of it or testing certain services of it and so on. And so because of that, we haven't necessarily tested the viability of things going forward and whether or not we want that. Well, we can translate that into fundraising too. So for instance, before we ever recommend having a development director, sometimes we'll try to ask an organization to use a temp to see if you were to actually have a full-time staff person in your office devoted to fundraising, what would they actually do? Or even look at an interim before you would even get to that stage. Because what you're doing is you're trying to test out what a staffing structure might be before you just say, we're going to get a development director and that will solve everything. But we really don't know necessarily how staff will operate within that environment that we currently have set up. So for instance, if you bring somebody on temporarily to help do some of your fundraising, what do you want them to do? Maybe go out or do you want them to be out of the office? Do you want them to be internal? And then in that instance, what is it that our organization needs to provide for them to be successful? Because what you're going to have to do is do that for anybody else, and you'll start to test those environments out together. So as we see this balance between short-term needs, long-term, paid versus volunteer, what we really want and what we really need, we'll tend to try and find a road or a path between all of that. And I'll say one thing before we get into the remainder of our conversation here is that organizations that want to be big, do all these other things, and believe that they need resources, I will say that we have found more organizations that we have encountered that have taken more of a lean role for a long time in capitalizing on certain activities and events before hiring their fundraiser full time. And in that road, they have maintained and sustained that staff member longer than just saying, we're going to go to a funder, we're going to ask them for a year's worth of salary and see if we can make it happen. Unfortunately, we have seen more time and time again that route leads to that fundraiser not being employed a year later. So let's go ahead and go into one big concept that we need to talk about first before we get into hiring somebody. And that's who is responsible for fundraising. And the answer should be it's just a development director or a staff person or parts of the board and so on. Yes and no. Here's the thing, is that what you see on your screen right now is what I would call the donor flow of an individual coming into the sphere of the organization and over time going through different cycles of being an annual donor, increasing their gift and upgrading it to be a mid-level donor, and then also doing other things for the organization to give more resources and so forth. If you see on your screen here, what we're discussing is that these individuals, as you'll see with my cursor here, start with that they tend to get on your list somehow. And from that list, we'll use certain tactics like meetings and so on to then become our donors, our annual donors. And some of them will upgrade to become our middle donors and so on. Well, in this system, there is somebody that has to be responsible for managing the fundraising system overall. And there has to be somebody responsible and or entities responsible for each one of the different areas that you see on the screen related to fundraising. So for instance, if we are looking at the left-hand side of your screen here, where it talks about acquisition channels overall, that means who is responsible on our organization's team, either paid or volunteer, for getting people to sign up for our newsletter, to get us new contacts, to be out there at the events, to try and get the people to at least hear about us. Sometimes this tends to be marketing. Sometimes it tends to be public relations, committees, volunteers, whatever it is. But somebody has to own that. In addition, somebody also has to own when they become donors after we send them materials to solicitations to actually become donors. So that's in that annual donor piece here. Usually we see that this lowest level, this lowest category of annual donors, we tend to use a lot of what we call passive fundraising mechanisms, direct mail, email, all of those types of pieces. More often than not, this is an area that staff tends to manage and oversee because it's more systematic, and also it doesn't require a lot of personal and leverage that we see in other gifts. However, when we get to mid-level donors and major donors, that's where we start to get more personal asking. We start to use a lot of volunteers meaning board members, advisory, corporate, all that other such as well. And so what we have to do as an organization before we hire somebody or before we account people to actually be responsible for certain elements of this is say to ourselves, who should be responsible for this? Who will be in charge of making sure that we build our list? Who will be in charge of asking that list for the first time to give? Who will be in charge of actually getting those people to increase their gift, maybe through personal ask, and then also increasing their gift even higher to major donors? For instance, your organization, it might be, the executive director is in charge of, if you're a small shop, maybe it's just an executive director and a program person. You might be in charge of doing all the outreach efforts and sending the first solicitations on behalf of the organization to get them to become donors. From there, you might ask volunteers, like your board members or development committee, to handle mid-level donors and major donors, only to try and help you, figure out from that standpoint who is responsible for at least aspects of our fundraising systems overall. So before going in, understanding who's responsible and how are you going to put in certain measures to say, well, the board, or the executive director, or even a development director from that standpoint is responsible here. And then you can create one of these that says, all right, so if we were to add a development director, what is it specifically that they would be overseeing? And in what categories of donors will they be going out and doing it? And also, where does the board and where the volunteers fit into this as well? As you'll see here, too, on the second page, I sort of say, who is responsible? Typically, we see this that the board is responsible for personal ask and oversight of the system in general, from an advisory as well as looking at it and ensuring that they're leading in those efforts going on in the community. The paid staff, from that standpoint, is in charge of personal ask and managing the system and ensuring that execution is occurring on a daily basis overall. And that volunteers, non-board members, also are a part of personal ask, but we could also use them in other things like retention and stewardship, thank you elements, all of those different things that help retain the donor or at least help us in moving that donor forward overall. As we look at this system, and as we look at the system before, as you'll see on your screen here, we need to create one that says, all right, our current system operates like this. This person or volunteer is in charge of marketing. This person is in charge, or individual or entity is in charge of annual donors, mid-level, and so on. And then as you grow the organization to create new sort of flow, donor structures here to say, in the next year, if we add a development person, that they will be responsible for this, and this is where volunteers will stay as well. This is a conversation you need to have with your board before prior going into any of this, we're going to hire somebody and we're just going to do it because life will be grand. We need to, and it's also a very good explanation to your board to ensure that they understand there still is a very important role they need to play in fundraising, and that just hiring somebody doesn't solve or take that away from them. And in fact, what we're doing is we're adding to the army of people out in the community asking for money. We're not taking people away. We still have to go out in the community and raise those funds. And more people we have in that army of ours to go help us go do that means that we'll have more tentacles into the community, and more hands out there to say, let's try and raise support. Okay, so now let's get into some of the human capital issues that, of course, a lot of us are here to talk about. Well, you see on your screen really 5 different development type structures that we see an organization go through in different stages. What I'm going to do is go through each one of these, and hopefully you'll be able to determine where you are as an organization and what you might want to think about in terms of how you beef up your staff, and to a certain extent to try and get into a level of hiring somebody as well. As we go through each one of those, there'll be some key things to understand here, is that what's ideal and what are certain challenges that might exist as you start to onboard that person into those particular roles. And then we'll finish, before we get to some of your Q&A, talking about some questions and some statements that you need to ask yourself, which will help you get to the point of what structure works best for you. So in stage 1, this is very typical. I'll say that this is ideal with a lot of small type organizations, where we'll see that early on in their existence that we have a board, a very committed group of volunteers, and they have either hired their first executive director, and or we might have some programmatic staff involved too as well. In this situation, that it probably overextended the board initially to bring on the first leading executive for the organization. And in that extension of the organization's resources, they have now sort of come out with it in the end to say, all right, now we're at least stable enough to move on to hiring more staff members. But usually in this phase, it was a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of touch and go. Maybe even the executive director took a lower salary than anticipated, only to try and help get that first person on there. What we usually see in this instance is very involved boards of directors, in which that they're performing roles that probably paid staff members would do, which is great. And to a certain extent, it might also limit them in the sense that, if board members and volunteers are performing highly skilled jobs for organizations, is that there are limitations when it comes to time and their ability to perform those things on a constant and consistent basis. And so therefore, your biggest challenge here is that the individuals, your capacity and your growth potential is only based upon that individual volunteer's ability to focus on you. And, of course, a lot of us are challenged with just making sure that they spend time on our cause in general. Asking them to do certain skilled roles can be very challenging. I'll say too here is that in this model, we see time and time again, and one of the biggest challenges to this is that one of the first leading personnel types, the executive leader, is being tasked with a lot of administrative functions, which in this case, that administration work tends to really delve into the fundraising time that should be spent asking for money. And what we have to look at here is, say, in the analysis of this kind of model, where we have a lot of volunteers who are probably going out asking for sponsorships, volunteers who are at the end of the year asking for their companies to support the organization, do all those things, is that how are we carving out time for the executive director to actually go out and make ask? Notice that I didn't say to run the fundraising, because we need to probably still keep the running of the fundraising at the volunteer level, because whatever you're paying this person, you need them to be out actually in the community asking for money so that you get the highest return back, knowing that personal asks tend to have the highest return in some of our fundraising systems. Now, here's another equal challenge, and this goes into the institutional funding route too as well, is that because a lot of organizations that are starting out might be heavily funded by foundations or sort of institutional type grant makers, the challenge of this here is that a lot of the fundraising time, if we're just sort of using that as an overarching bucket, is spent on institutional type fundraising than it is on individual type fundraising, only because that's where a lot of the seed capital and a lot of that type of capital is coming from. The challenge in that scenario is that the executive director is still fundraising and the board views them as being actively involved in fundraising, but they're really only running into a vicious cycle of sustainability with just one type of entity and funder, which is not really long term. And so you need to look at from a board's perspective to say, well, what is it that you're doing? And how can we as volunteers work closely with you to help manage foundation relationships so that we're still in our quote unquote fundraising time, spending half of our time going out there and actually asking for individual donations too as well. So it's kind of one of those to make sure that they're constantly looking at how many asks am I doing out in the community to ensure that I'm really getting there too. Because at this stage, it's one of those that we want to make sure that it's not just institutional type fundraising in general. All right. So in this stage one, what we noticed is that the board highly involves states of volunteers, usually when they still have the paid staff person that's involved, that staff person has been charged with doing fundraising, but they might not have allocated their time accordingly. The things you need to do as a board is say, how can we take the administrative functions of fundraising off of you, still keep that at the board level, potentially with volunteers who do not like asking for personal money, personal ask, and maintain that the executive director is at a stage where they can at least spend more time out asking for money. In addition into this stage, before you move into the next stage that we're going to talk about, the questions that you should be asking yourself is, is our executive director spending enough time? Are they out in the community asking for money? And if the answer is yes, a follow-up question would be, is that, are they actually being effective with that? And is that time being maintained week over week to make sure that they're actually raising the dollars? So what I'll tend to hear from organizations is, well, we just need a development person to go out there and do it. When then we'll start to analyze the executive director's time. And when we look at it, they're still being inundated with administrative work that could probably be off, given to somebody else before actually hiring a development person from that standpoint. All right, stage two. Now you're going to notice here that these are lines, that they're not filled in. And in our codes here, what we're talking about is that those that are boxes filled in are actually full-time members. And so in the stage two type organization, before hiring a full-time person, we highly recommend doing two things. One would be is hiring a part-time development assistant and a outsourced contracted grant proposal writer. In the past stage that I talked with you about, we tend to see a lot of executive directors spending their quote-unquote fundraising time on institutional type funding, which is grant proposal writing, outreach to them, managing grants, which is a duty that needs to be held. But what we have found is that by actually outsourcing that to grant proposal writers, really good, skilled ones, so that they can help manage that for you, obviously you still as an executive director and as a board team oversee anything that would ever go to a funder, but that you're working with a very effective proposal writer that has experience managing those types of grant proposals. And in this standpoint, that allows the executive director to move away from all the administrative with foundation government grant type work and really focus again on individual and asking time with fundraising in general. This also allows for you to, as an organization, to take care of some of the other administrative work with fundraising, which tends to be updating database systems if you hire a development assistant, and to also ensure that things like the direct mail, remember that lowest category of donors that I showed you in the piece earlier, that we could have those individuals be managed to a certain extent and be executed by the development assistant. So, for instance, if we had our chart here, we would say the development assistant's responsible for sending out direct mail and email campaigns to that lowest level, the donors between 0 and 100. Anybody above that might be brought back to the executive director and the volunteers from that standpoint. Ideal for small and growing organizations that have typically larger foundation support. And this is where I see the turning point start for organizations to move away from foundation support and more towards individual support, where they're starting to say, okay, we have a really good mix of institutional funders. Let's manage and maintain those. In addition, let's use that to help now garner more individual support. So the challenge here, though, is working with an outside contractor for the first time for some organizations. And the typical things, the negativity we get back in this scenario is an organization saying, we don't feel like they can write like us. We don't feel like they can do that. They just don't know our stuff. Well, again, nothing would ever leave your door without them. And to be quite honest, a really good grant proposal writer is probably much more sophisticated than an executive director in writing proposals that are effective. And since they're doing this for multiple clients, dealing with a lot of different ranges of funders, they tend to have a different perspective and know-how that probably the organization doesn't have. And so we never see it as a negative. We actually see it more as a positive, and it alleviates some of that constant administrative work that might be on the executive overall. From a development assistant standpoint, we've even seen, some of that some of that development assistant work really focused on that direct mail, email, all of those things that, some of the sponsorship administrative work if you're doing an event and so on. And what this allows you to do is that the executive director is pseudo-operating like a development director and allows the organization to then manage some people effectively before bringing on another individual that might be spearheading some of this. Because in this standpoint, it allows the executive director to still create the vision for fundraising, going out there and asking while utilizing some individuals to their extent. So we like this strategy when we see a lot of foundation institutional funding. It allows the executive director to get there. Board is actively involved in still asking for funds, getting sponsorships for events, that type of stuff. And we tend to see this as a step before hiring a full-time development director, so that the executive director is still in the process of working on major donors, which they will need to do anyway. And you're also that development assistant who might be a $10 an hour, $12 or $15 an hour type person is helping to create the infrastructure in place that the development director would need as well in the future. And that you're probably getting at a cheaper rate, and you're not necessarily paying somebody to spend a lot of their time indoors, because you want the development director, when you bring them on board, to actually be out there or going out and actually asking for money. So stage one is really focused on using a volunteer core and one paid staff member. Stage two, we're starting to use an outside proposal contractor and maybe a part-time development assistant. In stage three, again, we actually, sometimes this is a modified version before actually getting to a development director. This is a step we sometimes like to see happen in that where you can actually bring that development assistant on board, maybe in a title of development coordinator. Again, that manages a lot of the event pieces as well. And sometimes you might even need to hire an event person if you have an event that tends to do really well, and still maintain your grant proposal writer. We still see this is an organization size of maybe 500 to 1 million that, looking at in that stage three, that they're still outsourcing some of that grant proposal writing because they're not at a stage to hire a corporate and foundation relations type person, and at the same time that they still need that administrative work alleviated from the executive director and the volunteer core. In this standpoint, too, is the reason that we might hire an event person or an outside contractor to help us facilitate the event is that the event is maybe a one-time opportunity, one time in a year, piece that we might need heightened staff members to help us, but it isn't something that we would need maybe to maintain that staff member along the way. And lastly, I would say here too is that the executive director, as you start to add more staff in it, needs to help the staff and the board understand what's our fundraising objectives overall. So, for instance, grant proposal writer, your objective is to ensure that we retain our funding institutions as much as we can, even though that, retention could be a little challenging there, but ensure that we get the things that we need to on time, that we do the things that we do. From the development coordinator standpoint, it would be, your strategy is to help us raise those dollars as a coordinator level from the lowest level, and to help coordinate maybe some of our special events too as well. In the stage 4 is when we actually then recommend getting to a point where we hire a full-time development director. We'd love to maintain that development assistant along the way, coordinator, only because they have some great institutional pieces. And if it's necessary, maintain the proposal writer if you can. But from this standpoint, we sometimes will see that proposal writer will be brought back into the development director. Our challenge in hiring your first development director tends to be that they do a lot more administrative work, both on institutional funding and on individual giving. So in this standpoint, if we're maintaining the models that I just showed you, that we're maintaining staff who focus on a lot of that administrative work on lower levels, and that when we bring in a development director, they're really capitalizing on individual asking, larger corporate sponsorship levels, all of those things we really want them to do, go out and raise more money, rather than spending a lot of their time indoors actually doing administrative pieces. In this model, I'll say this tends to be $1 million, a little bit more in advance of dollars. Sometimes maybe between that $750 to $1 million too. $1 million, not $1 million too, but $750 to $1 million, in which that we're hiring our first development director, we can sustain them, and that we've built in relationships. The systems are in place. They don't have to worry about systems, maybe modifications based upon their own personal preference, and really they're out on the go, really going out and raising the money. Again, they're allocating time accordingly to a much more successful fundraising efforts, where the 3 fundamental people out in the community asking for money, the board, the executive director, and the development director, are spending most of their time doing it, while we have proposal writers and we have development assistants who are more behind the scenes helping to ensure that those happen. Now, from time to time, I will say that in order for this to occur, because as you go through these different stages, there's 2 assumptions. The budget continues to grow based upon the revenue that you're growing from hiring more people and taking the administrative work out, so the more ask out in the community means more money. You can see the logic there. That at this time, this stage, we're seeing potential good growth. You're at a stage where individuals are waiting to be asked. We have the connections. We see that happening. The organization is no longer in its infancy. We're in a sort of mid-level to higher level stage growth too as well. And then the last stage too that we tend to see sometimes is the board. We hire a foundation and corporate relations type person. We're just a client with ours right now is at $1 million, a little over $1 million, and they hired their first corporate foundation, the corporate and foundation relations, handling all proposals, handling all relationships, sponsorships, all of that. The development director, although overseeing that, is really focused on major gifting and overseeing the development strategy. And maybe at that time too, they'll bring down the coordination level a little bit lower, maybe back to a part-time too as well. Medium to large record keeping is starting to occur. But the board is still actively involved in a certain role with external solicitations. In addition to the board's role in some of those external solicitations, I'll say that in a lot of this stage, we're starting to see that the fundraising and both the work in the community and the brand has started to grow with it. Again, $1 million to $2 million type size organizations that they want to maintain those corporate and foundations, that they're no longer receiving those gifts per se as operational dollars, but more as project-based funding, and that the organization has the staff in order to execute. So also in this stage 5 is that we have the board, we elevate them, and the board has probably turned over, to be quite honest. We have new members of the board, not the same ones that helped get it going a while back. Some of them might be, but we tend to see new board members, new corporate partners, all those individuals that need to really help us elevate our ask. And so no longer is the board asking for $250 gifts. They're asking for $1,000, $10,000 gifts from their companies and also from others in the community. So we're scaling the organization's presence, the board opportunities there too as well. So let's go ahead and review back again the different stages. So as we started here from small to getting to those stage 5, there are certain things. In stage 1, we're operating in a very highly involved volunteer level, skill-based. They're going out asking for and soliciting, and the executive is. You would want to bring on and hire your first development staff. Notice I didn't say director, your first development staff, when you're ensuring that the executive director has maximized their fundraising time with both personal asking and institutional asking. That is a time when we need to start hiring our first development staff. We then look at, in that stage 2, probably in the $250,000 to $500,000 level, that we're starting to outsource some of our proposal writing to take that administrative off, and to also look at hiring maybe a part-time person to help us do some administrative fundraising efforts. Because as the budget's growing and as resources are starting to come in, more individuals are starting to be managed, and therefore the executive director's time really needs to be focused on that too. And at stage 3, we're probably talking $500,000 to $750,000 that we hire maybe a part-time coordinator or a full-time coordinator development role, handling a lot of that direct mail, passive forms of fundraising to the lowest base, and that we're still maybe using our outside contractor, maybe even an event type person to help us if we have a few special events that we're raising money from. Board and the executive director, highly involved in personal asking. We're still maximizing as much time as we can from the executive director and their time to go out and raise money. And then as we see in stage 4, hiring that first development director as we start to sustain and continue to build the base of donors over time. And in the last instance here, that we will look at ensuring that we're managing our fundraising and institutional funders too. And in the stage 5, this is larger growing organizations, million and above, sometimes even at the 1.5 or 2 million, that tend to bring in both a development director and a corporate and foundation relations. We've allocated time accordingly, both on individual ask and on institutional ask together. And we know that the board is elevated, know that they're no longer a part of lower level asking. Of course, it doesn't hurt if we need them to do that at certain times, but we're really asking them to go out and make those higher level connections for the organization overall. All right, so as you see through the different stages, here is when you should hire a development director in that stage 3 and 4. One is that the board members are actively involved in fundraising, and you need additional support for them. I mean, that's the thing. Notice I said 2 pieces here. Board members are actively involved in asking for money, and you need additional support. Please, I caution you away from hiring a development director where the board is not involved yet. Because what's going to happen is that hiring that person means that their involvement is not going to increase. It will maintain or decrease because they now view it as staff is there. The board members need to actively be involved in asking for money, and so does the executive staff, as you see on the second bullet there, and additional support is needed to help them do their work, to either help them be out there more or to help them get to a stage where we're bringing in more donors. The other thing is that notice I said in bullet 3 here, establish limitations on programmatic and administrative work on the executive leader. Is that you as an organization have defined clearly executive director, 100. This is how 100% of your time is allocated. 30% on program, 30% on fundraising and outreach, or 50, whatever that is. And that you have said it will not, if you're going over on some of those, we need to reallocate accordingly. The volunteers either need to take it off of your plate before we start bringing in some of this, and we'll kind of go through different models from that standpoint. Board members and existing staff will remain involved in fundraising. Here's I was working with an organization, and before, this is kind of taking it to the extreme, but before we brought in the development director, we had, as part of the board member expectations, to say that before we would make that hire, that every board member will have to make at least 5 to 6 asks before we have that development director in place, so that they can help manage relationships going forward. What we're trying to do is ensure that the board understands the role does not stop when the development director is. And the best thing you can do is use that sheet that I had earlier in the presentation to say this is how time can be allocated, And when we hire a development director or development assistant and coordinator before we get there, this is what they'll do. Now we're going to ask you to focus more of your energy on higher level donors as well. Segments of donors have been assigned, as we mentioned, and that there is a need for an actual development director to cover a segment of donors that's not being currently covered. And the question, when somebody asks me, Derek, should we hire a development director? I'll say to them, what segments of the donors do you want them to handle? What is it that you will handle as the executive leader, and board members, what will you do? And if they don't know, it typically means that they haven't allocated accordingly and that they have not had a discussion about their role going forward. They're just looking for somebody to solve it for them. Now, here's the thing about the budget. The last two things are probably the hardest numbers and things that we recommend. Our recommendation is that you're able to sustain the development director for a good 2 years. And the only reason why is that in a 1-year scenario, if you only have the money for a year, I will tell you some of the best fundraisers I know, it takes them time to develop relationships. And it takes a lot of social capital building to happen. And if you only have money for a year, you're asking somebody, and let's realistically look at it from the other perspective, from the donor's perspective, okay? You're looking at it from the donor's perspective. You are saying to that donor, this individual that you don't know will have a new relationship with you over the course of 6 months. You believe in everything, and that person will persuade you to give and give within the next 6 months to have your check in hand to us so that we can help sustain them going forward for the year 2. It is not typically possible to have that happen. It takes time. Now here's the thing that I'll get. Well, Derek, we need them to just manage our other relationships. Well, okay, but if you're hiring a development director to go out and raise more money, not to raise existing dollars, then you need to, you can probably hire a development coordinator to help you manage the administrative work with retention and stewardship so that you can go out there and just ask them to give their gifts. If you're truly hiring a development director to expand the fundraising role and expand the donor base, that means that you're asking them to go out and target new donors, new institutions, not the existing ones, because you're already working on those. New people, and you're asking them to turn relationships around in a year in which that they will get a check back and in the bank with you in a year. It's a challenge. I'll tell you, it's a challenge. And you need to at least have 18 months to 24 months worth of money set aside for them just to ensure that they can get to the stage of that. And yes, there are some fundraisers that come with Rolodexes, and there are some that will be really great and will be able to curve that. They're the outliers. It takes a little bit of time building that together. One of the things that you might want to consider is how can we go to major donors and other donors to say, we're going to put up 8 months worth of this, 9 months. Can you put up the other 9 months? And we'll give them a good running room. So it's not all just the organization. Have some donors to help you build the capacity that way as well. Realistic expectations on fundraising in year 1. Time and time again, the biggest disappointment on both ends, the fundraiser and the organization, is that the fundraiser wasn't able to raise enough money. And this is what we typically want them to do, is raise enough money to cover their salary in the first year. And that's a challenge, because what you're asking them to do is put forth the organization's agenda prior to a donor's agenda, and not saying, how can we come together? And in that agenda, you're going to ask a fundraiser to put things aside to ensure that they get just cash in the door. If you need cash in that scenario, there are other better tactics of asking your existing donors to upgrade using a development coordinator to help you make that ask and support you in that effort. Realistically, now it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be raising nothing. Don't get me wrong. They need to be producing revenue for the organization. It means that our expectations, if you have a budget of, say, to help them bring in their money or bring in at least their salary, we might be saying, in the first year we want you to raise maybe $50,000. And that $50,000 would come from corporate sponsors, or could come from individuals and so on. But in year 2, assuming that you have developed those relationships, we're going to have higher expectations. That's going to jump a little bit more, but maybe 150 to 200, only because that we have higher expectations now that you've had a good 18 months worth of legwork. If you provide that runway and provide the explanation that way, we'll typically see that the two will be satisfied, both the fundraiser and the organization. But if you're expecting that they're going to pay for themselves in that year one, and turn around new relationships that quick, I think you're going to be really challenged. And it's going to take a little bit longer than that for your donors to warm up to them, to see that this is a person that's going to be around and that they're going to be developing a relationship with long term for sure. Okay, so I know we're running here short, and we're going to come into some question now. So I said that we'd be done at 45. We're close to that after the hour. But before we get to the Q&A, and of course, put your questions into the go-to panel here on your screen, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can. And as usual, we'll get you out a little bit before the hour so you can get to your next meeting. But in here, I cannot stress enough both that the board is still actively involved, and that as a carrot to hiring somebody, that they continue to be involved before that, and that we have managed expectations and using outside resources potentially to help us to hire somebody, but that we have enough leg room and enough running room for them to be successful. All right, so remember, everybody needs to maintain fundraising role and their expectations throughout the process. A development director, when you should hire a development director, is knowing that you have maximized the fundraising time on your existing staff. And notice I did not say administrative time. I said fundraising solicitation time. If your members of your staff, after reallocating administrative duties and operational, have maxed out their time actually asking for money, you need to hire more people. If you have people that still are focused more indoors than they are outdoors, as a sort of metaphor, we need to make sure that we get them outside asking for money from certain individuals too. All right, so again, a couple of the questions that are come through here is, put them through with your go-to panel. We'll make sure we get to that. And also, I'd say too that as you're putting in your questions, one of the things that's come up is, will I have this presentation? Yes, I will. So we'll make sure and do that. We'll get this presentation to you. And any of the other documents I shared, I have that worksheet also too. I can share that with you as well. So here's the first question and it comes from Lori. Lori says, what would we typically expect to pay an outside grant writer or development assistant? Good question. It's all based upon, part of this is based upon where you live and work. And so I could give you what's happening with our client in Chicago versus in Indianapolis or in New York. We have clients in DC. We have clients in all areas. And it's all different. We've seen, let me say, in sort of in a development assistant and coordinator, that's where maybe you could, using somebody maybe right out of college or a part-time person, we have seen some of our clients be very successful with hiring somebody between $10 and $18 or $20 an hour, depending on where you are, $10 to $20 an hour to handle that type of role. You might even want to consider for a little bit of time that it might be like a stay-at-home mom or somebody else that might be interested in doing that. And in fact, one of our clients is a really great person that works virtually. She's stay-at-home and she does an incredible job. And she comes in and processes and does all the stuff to prepare them. She's just not always on site. So that's an option too. The outside grant proposal writer, that's, again, it's a little challenging. We have seen, what I would try and recommend is that you not do an hourly scenario if you don't have to, at least early on. Some grant proposal writers are not in love with that idea only because, they need to get to know you and it might take more time and so on. I'll usually try to say, if this year we're going to do, say, 5 grant proposals, kind of sketch out how many proposals you need to do and say we're going to do 5 proposals. It might be, if we average, say, $20 to $50 an hour, let's do a project-based billing for 5 proposals, $2,000. I don't know. That's kind of what I would try and do, is get them into project-based billing. The other thing that I would say with grant proposal writers is that early on, you'll have to spend a little bit of money to try and make sure that they talk like you, speak like you, do all of those other things. It's not bad money. It's good money. Just make sure, because that later on, as they get to know you and write for you and analyze things, that you won't have to go, continue to go back to that thing. So I've seen grant proposal writers on foundations be anywhere between $20 and $40, depending on locale, sometimes even as high as 50. When I see somebody higher than 50, it's usually that they're working on very unique, like big, large government grants that are, big system-wide grants, and they're doing government contract proposal writing, which is in a very different format than the foundation itself. All right. Another question is how integrated should a PR function be in development office for a mid-sized nonprofit? Is this a good idea for a recipe is this a good idea or a recipe for frustration? Javier, thanks. Yes. I have, I'll say this too. Somebody asked me the other day, what does the future development person look like? The future development director is probably going to be both a marketing and public relations and a fundraiser. Because the tactics used to solicit and because the tactics used to market in a small shop and a medium shop are going to be very similar, and you don't have the bandwidth and you don't have the time. So I definitely see that being one and the same. And we have a lot of medium-sized to small-sized shops that actually have VPs of advancement and public relations, vice president development and public relations directors who are the same person overall. So yeah, no, it's not a recipe for disaster. What I always see happen, which is a recipe for frustration from a board and executive standpoint, is that expectations on what role they play and how much. And a good example of this is events overall, where the board has some high expectation and the executive director has a high expectation that an event has a really big PR opportunity. And they'll ask the development person to spend more time trying to get the word out about the event and less time trying to solicit dollars for sponsorship and everything else. And so as long as you are very, very clear, we can manage that expectation. Over time, though, we'll see the two split apart. And once you get to that sort of 5 levels, that stage 5 that we see, that's time for you to probably hire a marketing and PR coordinator and start the same process in development before you're getting a marketing director from that standpoint. But yeah, that's kind of where we should go. It's a good idea to start early on, but you're going to have to separate the two, manage expectations overall. As we also see here, the next question is we want to support a development director for 24 months to build. However, I'm hearing the turnover in the position is around 18 months. It would appear to me that there is no sustainable ROI under this scenario. What would the new program paradigm for fundraising look like? Okay, so you're probably you're addressing a larger issue within the fundraising community in the nonprofit sector as a whole. And there's data out there that supports this. And me kind of wearing my other hat as an international board member for the Association of Fundraising Professionals, it's a very big concern that the turnover in fundraising is getting worse and worse. And part of that, there's if you look at the reports and you look at the things that are happening, it also there's the organization isn't off the hook. It's not just the individual. I've seen it happen time and time again where the expectations by the board and the staff is that now that we've hired somebody, now we got somebody, we're completely we're washing our hands of fundraising, and it happens by through the hiring of somebody, and so we're setting them up for failure, and so yeah, turnover does happen, and there are also there are some unsuccessful people who are in fundraising that shouldn't be as well. I say that at the 18 months only to give you the fair shot for them to be successful. But you have to create the plan for them to say, in the first 6 months, our expectation is that you don't raise any money, and that the board and the staff and the volunteers will go on with you with ask, and that we'll perform a lot of the ask for you and work with you on this stuff to introduce you into the community. The next 6 months, the month 6 to 12, we're going to expect that you're performing at least 30 different asks in the community, and that we have this sort of result. We will be along with you at times, but we're going to take a second seat to that. And then in month 13 through 18 or 16, it's going to look like this, in that we're not going to be any longer with you, and that our expectations are going to change there to try and get them to a point of 18 to 24 months to be successful. And I would say that will help you. And we have a new client right now a client that came on about 6 months ago where they came on, and that they also built in some capacity support for them to say, we also not only want to hire somebody, we want to have an outsider help them along the way and help us to ensure that they're getting as much support as we need. Because a lot of times that organization even though they're hiring somebody, they don't have the skills to professionally support somebody in their own. But then I know somebody would say, well, that's why we're hiring an outside person to come in and be the expert. Yes, but in the same time, you're asking their speed to be retrained to how you want them to go out and fundraise to be a little differently. So the new paradigm in fundraising looks like that we need a little bit more onboarding and ramping. We need outsiders to help them along the way. The other thing, too, is that I would say that you need somebody, a development director, to probably wear a couple different hats in their first year, maybe in that marketing and public relations, to show additional value beyond just the fundraising, to show that they're generating some brand awareness and some community interest from individuals that they may not have been secured the actual resources yet. I helped one of our clients evaluate a fundraiser who'd been there for a year, and he was the hardest working fundraiser we knew. Now, he wasn't getting the conversion that we needed. And it wasn't that he wasn't working hard. It wasn't that he wasn't skilled. There were some things that he could have done differently. But the audience he was trying to get money from just wasn't the historical audience that probably was going to get its support. So the organization had to reshift over. So it's going to have to be somebody who's like that, is to able to look at it holistically and say, we're going to spend as much time and resources as we can over the course of the next 18 months as well. All right. And so we have time for a couple more questions here. These are a little bit more yes, no's. Where would you go to hire somebody, a development director? Would you recommend a person from the for-profit world or actually with nonprofit experience? We have in the past hired somebody with nonprofit experience, and to be quite honest, they have not performed, and we're at our wits' end. Maybe there's a fundraiser in the for-profit world we should be considering. Thanks, Margie, for that. I'm not, we had another client that just hired somebody from the for-profit world because kind of the similar, not attitude, but the similar situation that they've come into. And they've adapted really well. The question is how much time are you going to help them understand the nonprofit field a little bit, how it works and operates, and manage their expectations. We usually see people coming into the sector that they think it's going to be a little bit easier than what it is. And so their expectations are a little bit different. But we do see some very successful business development people, and we do see some sales type people coming in and being successful in the fundraising side, especially with event type sponsorships in which they're selling tangibles and everything else when it comes to brand and recognition. And I would say that you should be interviewing anybody, even if they come from the government too, to see who's there. The thing at the end of the day with the development director is, can they cast a vision for fundraising, maintain it, execute it, and then secondarily, do you think that they'll have the ability to build rapport with individuals at higher levels? And that can come from any sector. So as long as they can do that and maintain and build in the expectations you have, you should be okay there. All right, so I am sorry we're right about the hour here. I apologize for that. Lots of other questions. Let me know. Feel free to email me or let me know if you need anything else too as well. We'll get you this presentation at a later date if you need it, and feel free to reply if you need any other certifications or credits. Thanks again for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be in touch on another Achieve webinar. Take care.